Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. Douglas Macgregor asserts that the onset of major crises or conflicts in U.S. history typically stems from a collective forgetfulness. He argues that many overlooked the crucial need to thoroughly analyze the regions involved and understand potential adversaries. He suggests a lack of concern for others' interests, particularly among Washington and globalist factions in Europe, who prioritize ideological goals over genuine interests. Macgregor highlights a perceived agenda to undermine Russia, emphasizing its refusal to conform to Western standards. He implies a push for Russian submission to Western dominance, both economically and militarily. Someone along the line must have questioned the true objectives behind the actions, revealing a goal to undermine Russia and Putin. This situation brings to mind Anthony Aiden's decision during the Suez Crisis in 1956, where he aimed to remove Nasser from power. However, such objectives seemed unrealistic and lacked a coherent current plan for implementation, reminiscent of past failures in history. The comparison to Hitler in the 1930s is misplaced, as is the portrayal of Putin as a Stalinist figure. Behind these actions may lie the interests of wealthy individuals, whether termed oligarchs or hedge fund billionaires, seeking to exploit Russia's resources for personal gain. Additionally, the lack of sustained attention from the American public towards international affairs exacerbates the problem, a pattern that has persisted for decades to disastrous effect. I don't think there's much, but if you go back to an interview that I did with Dimitri Simes in January, actually, I think it was his co-host George Beebe, former CIA. No, sir. It was in January before this whole thing got started, and they were asking people to make predictions. Well, one of my predictions, like so many others, was wrong. And that was, I said the Russians absolutely go in. I was correct. I said that by the time this is over, NATO will collapse. I said that in January of 2022, the thing that I got wrong, and I think a lot of us did, was that the Russians would go in as carefully, deliberately, and cautiously. As it turned out, we were not privy to the Russian General Staff's instructions from the president. Putin, who genuinely sought to avoid conflict, attempted to send signals to the West, unaware of the extent of corruption and hostility among the globalist elites in Europe and the United States. He likely did not anticipate the intense opposition and the desire for war from these quarters. There was an expectation that people would oppose a war in Europe, recalling conversations with NATO colleagues in the past who believed NATO existed to prevent such conflicts, not to initiate them. However, the reality is that the situation has been orchestrated by Washington with support from London and Paris, and Europe will bear a heavy cost unless they recognize and address this reality. Despite this, there seems to be a lack of concern, particularly from Washington. Personally, having grown up alongside Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans, I hold a deep affection for them, which motivated my studies in Germany. And then my interest grew, especially as we found ourselves facing the Russians. I made efforts from the outset to comprehend the various players involved, though I doubt I ever fully grasped the complexity. What I can say with certainty is that nobody in Washington seems to comprehend it at all. The government in Warsaw has exhibited strong hostility towards Russia from the outset, driven by emotional hysteria portraying Russia as inherently evil and viewing Ukrainians as potential subjects of their own imperial ambitions. However, this perception seems to be shifting. Recent information suggests that 52% of Poles now express a desire to stay out of the conflict in Ukraine, focusing instead on managing the influx of Ukrainian refugees. This shift makes it challenging for Poland to continue serving as a proxy for American interests. Previously, Ukraine was used as a means to exert pressure on Russia, pushing boundaries and deploying troops and weapons near Russia's borders. However, unlike past conflicts involving artificial constructs, Russia is a formidable nation-state. Now we're facing the consequences of our actions, and Americans are beginning to question why so much aid is being sent to Ukraine when there are pressing needs at home. It's a simple yet effective awakening. Well, it's important to note that Vladimir Putin's primary goal isn't to govern Ukrainians. He's not eager to cross that river in March. His focus lies on historically Russian areas where Russian speakers reside. He has consistently expressed intentions for cities like Kharkiv and Odessa to become Russian once more, and it's likely to happen. Simultaneously, he's observing the actions of the West. The German government under Scholz faces significant instability with low approval ratings and public discontent over economic issues. Germans are realizing the consequences of their nation's direction without their input. Emotional displays, such as Chancellor Merkel's refusal to shake Lavrov's hand, are seen as immature by Moscow. Moscow anticipates changes in European leadership, particularly in Germany and France, which could lead to a shift in policy. Meanwhile, Washington remains entrenched in its own policies, reluctant to admit mistakes or backtrack on its statements. Currently, there are approximately 37 Ukrainian brigades stationed along the defensive line, facing constant attacks and casualties. In contrast, Russia has a reserve of 300,000 troops, which Putin hesitates to deploy fully, fearing NATO intervention in western Ukraine. Such a scenario would escalate into a war he never desired but would feel compelled to win. He cannot afford to retreat now. Allowing a potential rump state to emerge and possibly join NATO is not an option. Ukraine should have remained neutral from the start, and he knows it. This decision ultimately rests with Vladimir Putin, who carefully considers various factors before committing forces. Contrary to popular belief, he doesn't want to escalate violence against Ukrainians, especially considering their Orthodox Christian ties. He understands the complexity of military operations, particularly regarding the absence of F-16s with airborne warning and control systems, which are crucial for effective targeting. This limitation means that the conflict's dynamics are unlikely to change significantly anytime soon. It's important not to absolve senior military leaders of responsibility for the situation. Some held unrealistic notions about warfare, reminiscent of the final year of World War II, where inadequate air and missile defenses led devastating losses for armored formations. The Ukrainians face a similar vulnerability due to their lack of air and missile defense systems, leaving them in a precarious position. While Putin appears cautious, he also seeks opportunities to advance his objectives. The concern lies in misinterpreting his reluctance to escalate his weakness, potentially leading to further miscalculations. In my experience, cluster munitions are effective against softer targets like humans and wheeled vehicles, but have little impact on tanks and heavy equipment. However, they pose a risk due to the presence of duds, which require clearance afterwards. During the Gulf War, numerous injuries occurred when civilians, unaware of the danger, encountered these unexploded munitions. This contributed to the perception that the investment in cluster munitions wasn't worthwhile, especially considering the depletion of artillery ammunition. This situation echoes Napoleon's surprise at Borodino when he found the Russian army possessing more artillery than his own. Such miscalculations are fueled by prejudice, ignorance, and emotional hostility from a small elite, as the average American remains indifferent. Despite having approximately 37 brigades deployed across a vast area, their effectiveness is compromised by understrength units and a lack of air and missile defense. Engaging in combat under such conditions is suicidal, particularly considering the age range and inexperience of many Ukrainian fighters. Sadly, the conflict persists due to the unwillingness leaders to admit fault and the inflated egos driving their decisions. This results in countless Ukrainian casualties, a toll that could be prevented if Washington acknowledged its mistakes and intervened to end the conflict. Yet the situation persists, with more Ukrainians destined to die needlessly. Comparing this to a Disney production highlights the ignorance of those in power who fail to grasp the human cost of their actions. With over 60,000 amputees already, the toll of this conflict continues to rise. I propose an immediate suspension of all military aid and the initiation of negotiations on neutral ground to understand Russia's objectives. Historically, we've failed to listen to the Russians, much like our approach with China. Media catalogs who champion borderless, lawless globalism cannot bully their way through international affairs indefinitely. While sweeping governmental change seems necessary, our political system poses challenges unlike parliamentary systems seen elsewhere. Similarly, we witnessed political faces change while policies remain consistent, a phenomenon evident in Europe, where parties labeled as far-right are often misrepresented. Turmoil and turnover may be inevitable before significant change occurs, as observed in Britain's tumultuous political landscape. The notion of perpetual global dominance by a select few is untenable and opposed by many.